a force with no tanks, no heavy guns, yet armies needed them more than maps. Long before the world spoke of desert offensives and sweeping armored columns, another tradition had already taken root in Sirenica, one shaped not by machines, but by memory, faith, and the harsh logic of survival on open sand. What would later be called the Senusi Scouts began as something older and deeper, forged in a struggle that predated the Second World War by a generation. When Italian troops landed in Libya in 1911, they came expecting a short colonial war. What they found instead was a landscape that refused to be conquered easily, and a population whose knowledge of it far outmatched their own. As the fighting moved inland from the coast, Senusi fighters broke into small mobile bands, slipping between wadis and dunes, choosing where and when to strike. Their strength was never measured in firepower. It lived in familiarity with shifting sands, in the names of wells half hidden beneath rock, in the webs of kinship that linked tribes across the Jebel Akhdar. The Italians controlled the ports. The Senusi controlled everything that lay beyond the horizon. What made this resistance unusual was the force behind it. The Senusi order was not a conventional army, but a religious and social network, stretching from coastal lodges to remote desert zawiyas. Its leaders mediated disputes, offered instruction, and kept the rhythms of life steady in a land where empires came and went. Loyalty flowed toward them not because of military rank, but because they were custodians of the community. When war arrived, that same structure became the backbone of resistance. A message sent from one zawiya could travel farther and faster than any formal dispatch, passed from sheikh to sheikh, tribe to tribe, until a pattern of action emerged from hundreds of small decisions. By 1917, this long struggle reached a turning point. After years of attrition and shifting fortunes, the Senusi leadership entered negotiations with Britain, whose influence stretched across the Egyptian frontier. It was during this period that Sayyid Idris, later known as King Idris, rose as a figure capable of bridging two worlds. Idris understood the weight of tradition, but also the limits of continued war against a better-equipped enemy. Through careful diplomacy, he secured a measure of autonomy for Sirenica, while preserving the Senusi structure beneath it. The agreements did not bring peace everywhere, nor did they end tensions with Italy, but they allowed a generation to regroup and rebuild. Yet the interwar years brought no lasting reprieve. When Italy renewed its campaign to dominate Libya in the 1920s, the conflict hardened into a brutal reconquest. Villages were uprooted, tribes displaced, and Senusi networks targeted. The death of Omar al-Mukhtar in 1931, after years of leading one of the most determined guerrilla campaigns in the region, seemed to close a chapter. Many families fled toward Egypt, others remained, navigating a new landscape of restrictions and surveillance. But traditions do not vanish simply because a regime demands it. Knowledge of the desert persisted in stories, in routes walked at night, in the memories of those who had crossed these sands since childhood. Even fractured, this knowledge remained potent. On the Egyptian side of the frontier, British officers kept careful track of these shifting circumstances. Some had served in North Africa long enough to witness the consequences of Italy's campaign. Others were new to the region, but quick to understand that no modern map provided what the Senusi could offer. An instinct for direction when storms erased all traces of a road, an eye for tracks that separated a wandering camel from a moving patrol, an understanding of which wells could sustain life and which were little more than salt traps. As tensions rose in Europe during the late 1930s, these officers found themselves returning to a familiar idea, one that Idris and his followers considered cautiously but did not reject. War, once again, was coming to North Africa. Italy's ambitions in the Mediterranean were clear, and British strategists knew the Egyptian frontier would not remain quiet for long. In this uncertainty, the desert became both shield and vulnerability. For Britain, defending Egypt meant preparing for a campaign across land they barely knew. For Idris, the gathering crisis opened an opportunity, collaboration that might benefit his followers, restore some measure of influence, and position Sirenica for a future beyond colonial rule. By 1939, conversations between Idris and British officials in Cairo had grown more urgent. Reports describe tentative proposals to recruit small auxiliary groups drawn from Senusi refugees and tribal networks, men accustomed to the desert's harshness and capable of moving where regular patrols struggled. These were not to be soldiers in the conventional sense, but guides, trackers, and scouts whose expertise could anchor entire operations. The idea aligned with long-standing Senusi traditions, protecting tribal routes, offering safe passage, and observing the movement of outsiders. All the while, the world beyond the desert edged closer to catastrophe. Europe collapsed into war in September 1939. Italian forces massed across Libya, and British commanders in Egypt watched the frontier with increasing unease. In this tense quiet, the groundwork for the Senusi Scouts took shape not through grand announcements, but through small decisions, renewed trust, and the recognition that the next war in North Africa would be decided not only by tanks and aircraft, but by those who understood the land beneath them. By early 1940, the desert's stillness no longer felt natural. Caravans moved less freely. Italian patrols pushed deeper into tribal territory. British reconnaissance flights traced patterns of activity along the frontier, and somewhere in the spaces between these movements, former fighters, guides, and sheikhs prepared for another chapter. The skills they carried tested in an older war were about to become indispensable once more. The question that lingered now was how their knowledge would be shaped, used, or tested when conflict finally arrived. And that moment was closer than anyone could admit aloud. Before a patrol moved, the desert already had eyes. Long before engines started or orders were read out on a parade ground, word had already travelled along tracks and campfires from Cyrenaican tents to Egyptian towns. Men who had once fought under the Senusi banner, or who had grown up hearing stories of those campaigns, now found themselves in exile or on the margins, watching another storm gather over the same horizon. In the summer of 1940, the small coastal town of Matruh, once just a quiet way station on the road between Alexandria and the Libyan frontier, began to change. British lorries rolled in more frequently. New tents and huts appeared on the outskirts. Uniforms from distant regiments crowded its streets. Somewhere amid this bustle, in offices marked more by dust than ceremony, a quieter process unfolded. British officers and Senusi representatives met, exchanged names, and outlined a force that would never resemble a conventional battalion on paper, yet would prove far more suited to the ground on which they would operate. For the British, the logic was straightforward. Italy had declared war in June 1940. An invasion across the Libyan-Egyptian border was no longer a question of if, but when. The Western Desert Force needed eyes that could see beyond the reach of its periscopes, beyond the curvature of dunes, beyond what even a reconnaissance flight might miss. They needed men who could move out ahead of their lines, read the land instinctively, and return with information that maps and aerial photographs could not provide. Among the refugees and exiles who had followed Idris into Egypt, the British saw precisely that. Many had grown up in tribal caravans or coastal oases, learning navigation as a skill woven into daily life. They knew the scent of a well before it came into view, the age of a track by the depth of its imprint, and the mood of the desert by the way morning winds curled around its ridges. These were not lessons taught in classrooms or training manuals. They were inherited, practiced, and trusted. But for Idris and his advisors, the decision to formalize such a force carried political weight. Memories of Italian repression, displacement, punitive campaigns, and the shadow of concentration camps were still raw. Many recruits had lost homes, grazing lands, or entire family lines during the reconquest of the 1920s and early 1930s. To join the British was not simply to enlist, it was to align with a power that might help restore a future for Sirenica, or, if things went poorly, deepen the costs of earlier losses. Idris balanced all this carefully. The agreement he reached was pragmatic, The British would provide stipends, rifles, camel saddles, and later radios, while the Senusi would provide personnel, authority, and the intangible asset the British needed most, local trust. Recruitment began quietly. Tribal elders, familiar faces from Zawiya circles, and respected caravan leaders helped identify men who understood the desert not merely as a place, but as a system. Some came from families with long memories of resistance. Others were younger men, drawn more by opportunity or by a desire to support their displaced communities. There was no grand parade or formal enlistment ceremony. Most began their service in small groups, issued simple uniforms or armbands to distinguish them when necessary, but always retaining the manner and bearing of the tribes from which they came. Training blended the old with the new. British officers demonstrated marksmanship and basic field protocol. The Senusi, in turn, taught camel handling, how to saddle quickly, how to manage long rides at night, and how to interpret subtle signals. The way a camel hesitated when sensing an unseen slope, or how its breathing changed near underground water. Other sessions focused on liaison work, how to deliver messages, how to signal to British patrols without being mistaken for enemy scouts, and how to move between units without disrupting operational secrecy. The scouts' identity rested between categories. They were part police, tasked with monitoring borders and maintaining security along refugee routes. They were part of the militia, capable of defending themselves and leading small military parties. And they were part intelligence service, gathering information through observation, conversation, and the rumor networks that naturally flowed across desert communities. It was a hybrid structure, informal but effective, flexible enough to adjust as the war evolved. Their earliest tasks were modest but essential. Some scouts were sent along the frontier to observe Italian positions, noting small shifts in patrol patterns or sudden silences where activity had previously been steady. Others moved inland toward remote wells, checking whether they were functional, abandoned, or tampered with. These reports mattered. A single well, dry or poisoned, could alter the movement of an entire brigade. And when British forces began tracking Italian supply movements, it was often the scouts who could confirm whether a distant dust cloud belonged to a convoy, a troop column, or simply wind pushing sand along an old path. As the summer pressed on, tension tightened across the frontier. Italian forces gathered strength in Libya, building supply dumps, fortifying positions, and readying their troops for an advance into Egypt. Every day, the scouts returned with new fragments of information: how many vehicles passed a certain track, which direction tracks bent after leaving an outpost, which oases showed unusual signs of military presence. Nothing they brought back was dramatic on its own, but together these fragments formed a picture more accurate than any intelligence summary compiled elsewhere. By early August, British commanders were convinced that the frontier would not remain quiet. Their preparations intensified, and with them, the responsibilities placed on the scouts. What had begun as an auxiliary experiment was now becoming a critical part of frontier defense. The scouts sensed it too. Patrols lengthened, movements grew more urgent. Nights grew busier along old caravan paths. Their first real test was approaching, carried on the same wind that once carried refugee caravans eastward, and the moment it arrived would reveal just how valuable their presence had become. Operation Compass moved fast, but only because someone knew where to move. When Italian forces crossed into Egypt in September 1940, pushing eastward towards Sidi Barrani, they carried the weight of expectation behind them. Mussolini wanted a quick advance, a symbolic strike that would show Italian power. But from the moment the first columns rolled across the frontier, the scouts watching from the desert understood a truth the invaders had not yet grasped. The desert would decide the speed, not the timetable. Italy's first push caught no one entirely by surprise. For weeks, Senusi patrols had reported unusual clusters of vehicles and supplies along the Libyan side. They noticed the tightening of security around certain wells, the clearing of ground for camps, and the arrival of new engineering units. These signs, passed quietly from tent to outpost to British liaison officers, helped confirm that the frontier would not remain stable much longer. Still, when the Italian thrust finally came, it carried a weight that even experienced observers felt in their bones. Dust spiraled upward in long columns as trucks and tanks pressed eastward, stopping only when engineers could set up the next chain of camps. From the British point of view, the advance seemed bold, but strangely hesitant. Italian forces moved along predictable routes, roads built under peacetime ideas, water points that were obvious and regularly spaced, lines of communication open to disruption. For a regular army, these choices made sense. Those who lived in the desert showed weaknesses. The Scouts, moving far ahead of British units, paid close attention not just to what the Italians used, but to what they ignored, and side routes that disappeared into rocky plains before reappearing kilometers away. When these findings reached British planning rooms, officers began to see advantages they had not previously considered. As the Italians set up fortified camps near Sidi Barrani, the Scouts' role deepened. Small teams followed the movement of Italian patrols, watching how often they checked wells and how rarely they left the main road network. At night, Scouts listened for the hum of engines, judged the size of columns by the glow of their lights behind distant ridgelines, and measured how many hours a supply convoy took to reach its destination. This information, passed back to British headquarters, helped shape the counterattack that would soon be known as Operation Compass. When the British advance began in December 1940, its reputation for speed and surprise depended in part on choices guided by these quiet observations. British commanders understood where strongpoints were weakest, how Italian forces reacted to sudden pressure, and which flanking routes could be safely used. Scouts had confirmed that certain escarpment edges were passable, even for trucks, as long as drivers knew the right angle of approach. They identified wells that stayed usable despite Italian attempts to block them, and when doubts remained, a Camel patrol would often reach the site ahead of the main force, making sure no unit marched into a trap. One constant challenge was reading the desert itself. Winter storms swept across the frontier, wiping out tracks within minutes. Under such conditions, an armored unit could quickly lose its sense of direction. But the Scouts recognized patterns invisible to outsiders: the direction of grain on hard sand, the angle of soft drifts along the sheltered sides of dunes, the faint traces of old caravan marks that survived beneath surface layers. These details guided British detachments that cut across ground the Italians believed could not be crossed. More than once, a decision to move along one of these half-forgotten paths allowed British troops to appear where Italian sentries believed no force could approach. During the height of Compass, when Italian resistance began to break under constant pressure, the Scouts turned their attention to securing the interior. Italian detachments, scattered and confused, tried to escape capture by slipping into remote areas or heading toward oases they thought unguarded. Scouts moved quickly to these places, checking for signs of recent passage, listening for voices inside abandoned buildings, and tracking the direction of fleeing groups by the depth and spread of footprints. Their work prevented small bands from reorganizing and, in some cases, allowed British units to surround isolated enemy positions before they had time to regroup. What made this phase of the war striking was not just the size of the British victory, but the way it depended on information drawn from lives spent in the desert. The Scouts never numbered many, and rarely appeared in formal reports. Yet their influence shaped the flow of the campaign. A single report about the state of a well, or the absence of Italian guards along a track, could change a brigade's entire movement. And in a landscape where fuel, water, and direction decided survival, these details were often crucial. By February 1941, Operation Compass had ended. British forces had captured large numbers of Italian troops and advanced deep into Libya. The momentum of the war seemed to have shifted sharply, but beneath the headlines, a quieter reality remained. The desert was far from under control, and the next opponent would not be as predictable as the last. German troops, soon to arrive under Erwin Rommel, would bring new tactics, new mobility, and new uncertainty. For the Scouts, this meant a new phase of the war, one in which their knowledge would be tested against an enemy that adapted quickly and moved with a speed the desert had not seen before. And somewhere in Cairo, officers of a different unit, the long-range desert group, were already asking about the men whose guidance had shaped compass. They, too, would soon look for the expertise that lived along the old Senusi routes. The desert, once again, was getting ready to change. The best navigators in the desert met the best long-range drivers. When the long-range desert group arrived in the deep interior in 1941, they brought a style of warfare unlike anything the region had seen. Small patrols, long-range reconnaissance, and a willingness to cross ground others deemed empty, unreachable, or deadly. But even they understood that speed and skill were not enough. To survive in the Sahara, they needed knowledge older than the maps they carried, knowledge held by the Senusi guides, who moved through this world as naturally as sailors across the sea. The LRDG had already earned a reputation for operating far behind enemy lines. Their modified Ford and Chevrolet trucks, stripped of unnecessary weight and fitted with desert navigation tools, could cross hundreds of kilometers of open sand without infrastructure or resupply points. Yet, despite their technical skill, the men of the unit quickly saw a truth that echoed through every desert war. Equipment could fail, but memory rarely did. No sun compass, no prismatic chart, could replace someone who understood how sand sounded under different temperatures, or how a horizon subtly shifted when hiding a wadi's entrance. The Senusi presence grew naturally from earlier cooperation. British officers who knew their abilities recommended them to the LRDG, and soon small groups of guides began joining patrols, heading west toward Kufra or north toward the Italian outposts scattered across Sirenica. The partnership was formed without ceremony. A few men, dressed in simple robes or light uniforms issued by British stores, would climb into the trucks, settle among the supplies, and begin studying the route ahead with quiet focus. Early missions showed how well the two groups fit together. The LRDG understood engines, distances, and mechanical limits. The Senusi understood wind patterns, animal tracks, and the way dunes shifted between seasons. When an LRDG patrol wanted to bypass an Italian outpost, a Senusi guide might point toward a stretch of gravel plain that looked empty to outsiders, explaining that a hidden dip ahead would hide the trucks from view. When the patrol needed to know whether a distant patch of green marked a real oasis or just heat distortion, a guide could judge by the height and thickness of the mirage whether water might lie beneath it. Nowhere did this cooperation matter more than in the operations around Kufra. The oasis, remote and lightly held, was a potential key base for Allied operations, but reaching it meant crossing some of the region's toughest terrain. Free French forces, planning to seize the area, needed accurate guidance and a reliable supply line. Here, Senusi guides were essential. They pointed out wells that could still support small groups, warned which ones were seasonal or polluted, and explained how the shape of sand ridges signaled deeper basins that could trap vehicles. Their sense of the seasonal movement of herds and caravans allowed Allied troops to move without drawing the attention of Italian patrols based in the region. The LRDG's sun compass, often seen as the heart of their navigation system, became even more effective when paired with Senusi knowledge. The guides could tell when a bearing felt wrong, even when the instrument insisted otherwise. They sensed the desert as a living environment, not a fixed map. Slight changes in sand color or hardness showed shifts into landscapes the LRDG had not charted. This intuition sometimes saved hours of detours or stopped trucks from sinking into soft dunes that stretched for kilometers. Equally important was their role as cultural go-betweens. Many oasis communities were cautious about contact with armed groups, unsure what would happen if Italian authorities discovered their cooperation. A Senusi guide could speak to villagers, read their mood, and judge whether an approach was safe. Sometimes the guide would simply ask for water or news, blending the meeting into normal desert life. Other times, he would act as interpreter, helping LRDG officers gather information about Italian garrisons, supply movements, or local complaints. These conversations provided intelligence that no aerial photograph or intercepted message could match. The relationship between the LRDG and the Senusi guides was not romantic or mysterious. It was practical. Both groups deeply respected the desert, and both knew that mistakes were unforgiving. When a truck lost its direction during a sandstorm, the guide listened to the wind and judged direction by how grains struck his skin. When a patrol needed to hide for a day, he pointed out hollows invisible until one stood directly above them. And when an LRDG commander wondered whether a certain ridge could hide enemy patrols, the guide studied the slope and predicted how sound would travel across it at different times of day. As Axis activity increased in 1941 and 1942 with the arrival of Rommel's Africa Corps, these joint patrols grew even more important. Italian posts became more watchful, and German scouting units showed a mobility more in tune with the desert than the Italians had shown earlier. This raised the risk of every mission. Moving unseen meant choosing routes even more obscure than before. The guides, drawing from tribal memory and long-ignored caravan paths, led patrols through corridors the enemy never imagined motorized units could cross. The partnership lasted despite its informal nature. No one issued grand statements about cooperation, nor wrote lengthy rules about the role of local expertise. The desert itself set the terms. The LRDG needed guides who could keep them alive in terrain where a wrong choice could mean disaster. The Senusi, in turn, saw in this cooperation an opportunity to weaken Italian control, support Idris's position, and ensure their communities remained part of the region's changing future. By late 1942, as rumors of a new Axis offensive spread, and the war seemed to tighten its grip on Sirenica once more, the value of this collaboration grew. Both groups felt that the next phase would be harder, faster, and more unpredictable than anything that had come before. And the Scouts, who had watched the desert change under Italian and British movements, now prepared to watch it shift once more, this time under an enemy who moved with the speed of a sandstorm. Ahead lay a struggle not just for territory, but for control of movement itself, in a landscape where movement was life. When armies leapfrogged across Sirenica, only one force stayed rooted. From 1941 to 1943, the desert became a landscape of constant motion, British columns advancing west, Axis forces sweeping east, and then the pattern reversing just months later. Towns changed hands again and again. Roads that had been supply routes one season became retreat corridors the next. But through every shift, the Senusi Scouts remained in place, moving with neither army's schedule but with the slower, steadier rhythm of the land they understood. The arrival of Rommel and the Africa Corps changed the war in ways the Scouts felt almost at once. German units moved with a speed and flexibility the Italians had rarely shown. Their reconnaissance vehicles probed deep into open ground, and their armoured thrusts crossed escarpments that regular planners had once dismissed as impossible. With every advance, the frontier changed shape. Yet even as front lines swung back and forth across Sirenica, the Scouts kept watching from the edges, tracing the routes armies used and the ones they ignored. Watching the shifting front was a detailed and careful task. Scouts placed themselves near key wadis, along camel tracks, and beside wells where both Axis and Allied forces might appear without warning. They read dust clouds from afar, judged the number of vehicles by sound, and noticed when certain roads went suddenly quiet. Each piece of information moved through layers of trust, from tribal messenger to scout, from scout to British liaison officer, and then into intelligence reports that guided larger decisions. What made their reports valuable was not dramatic secrets, but consistency. They understood how the desert normally behaved, so they noticed quickly when something felt wrong. Their role went beyond observation. With villages uprooted and families scattered, Idris's networks relied on the scouts to keep order and communication across isolated communities. The Italian reconquest years had already strained these ties. Now, the war threatened to cut them completely. Scouts carried messages between elders, guided refugees escaping advancing armies, and, when necessary, warned communities to avoid areas about to become battlefields. In this way, they helped protect a fragile social fabric as military lines surged across it. This stability strengthened Idris's position in his dealings with the British. Reports from the time describe how his authority, once weakened by exile and displacement, regained influence because his followers could still move through the interior with relative safety under scout protection. British administrators, aware of this, increasingly treated Idris not just as a symbolic leader, but as someone who could secure local cooperation in regions where Allied control remained weak. The Scouts, through their freedom of movement, became the quiet proof of that influence. But the Scouts' responsibilities also became more dangerous. Axis patrols quickly learned to exploit tribal rivalries or spread rumors that could damage trust in Idris's supporters. In some areas, German units tried to hire guides or offer money for information. Scouts answered by strengthening their own networks, relying on long-standing relationships to decide which informants could be trusted. They watched for signs of manipulation, unusual meetings, sudden changes in travel patterns, or unfamiliar faces lingering near wells. Counterintelligence in the desert was less about catching written messages and more about reading social signals. And in this field, the Scouts had an advantage that outsiders rarely understood. One of their most important tasks was guarding wells and tracks. In a regular war, strategic points are forts, bridges, or supply depots. In the Sahara, there were water and paths, simple features but essential for any significant movement. A well that fell into enemy hands could change an entire campaign. A track left unwatched could allow a surprise flanking move. Scouts checked these sites regularly, noting which had been visited recently, which showed signs of damage or sabotage, and which were still safe for Allied use. Their efforts stopped Axis forces from using remote oases as bases, and made sure British convoys could travel without constant fear of running out of water. Another part of their work unfolded far from major battles. As air combat increased, Allied pilots were often forced to land or bail out over desert areas not under their own control. The British Mi-9 set up escape and evasion routes to recover these men. But the system could not work without local help. The Scouts became vital guides in this secret effort. They found stranded airmen by reading faint tracks or by guessing their likely direction from wind patterns and terrain. They led them along hidden routes, avoiding Axis patrols, and brought them toward Allied lines. To those rescued, the desert often felt endless and confusing. To the Scouts, it was a familiar landscape full of signs others could not read. Yet their reasons for serving were never all the same. Some served out of loyalty to Idris, others out of resistance to Italian rule, and still others because the role gave income and protection to their families. This variety did not weaken the force. It reflected the complexity of Sirenica itself, a region shaped by overlapping identities, loyalties, and memories of past conflicts. British officers learned not to see this as an inconsistency. A guide's loyalty to tribe or zawiya did not rule out commitment to the wider effort, as long as mutual respect was kept. By late 1942, the tide began to turn. Allied victories pushed Axis forces westward, and for the first time in years, Sirenica seemed ready to regain some stability. But the Scouts knew that retreating armies could be unpredictable, and the final months of Axis presence brought new dangers: scattered units searching for supplies, patrols moving without a clear plan, and communities caught in the middle. Through it all, the Scouts worked to keep Idris's networks whole, making sure that when the war moved on, Sirenica would not be left broken beyond repair. As Axis troops withdrew toward Tunisia, a new question appeared, one that military maps could not answer. If the desert were no longer contested, what role would the Scouts play in the future? They had guided armies, protected communities, and supported a political cause. But with victory close, their purpose would soon shift from wartime need to part of Libya's uncertain path toward self-rule. Ahead lay choices no less serious than those faced in war, as the Scouts moved from the edges of conflict into the early foundations of a state. The war ends, but the Scouts' future is suddenly uncertain. By late 1942, as British and Commonwealth forces pushed Rommel's troops out of Sirenica, a sense of possibility returned to the interior for the first time in years. Wells no longer stood at risk of sudden occupation. Villages, long used to upheaval, waited for news instead of preparing for flight. And across the region, the Senusi Scouts found themselves in an unfamiliar role, not the watchers of an advancing enemy, but the caretakers of a land coming out of war. British authorities, faced with the fragile security situation left behind by retreating Axis forces, turned to the Scouts almost at once. They needed a force capable of operating in remote regions, calming tensions, and ensuring that looting, revenge, or disorder did not undermine their broader military aims. Yet turning the Scouts into a formal body brought its own problems. They had operated loosely, shaped by tribal ties and local needs, rather than strict military structure. Now, British administrators considered folding them into a kind of early gendarmerie, a more organized frontier force that could police Sirenica and support the rebuilding of civil authority. For Idris, this moment carried high stakes. His influence had grown because the Scouts had kept trust alive in areas where wartime pressures could easily have torn communities apart. Their continued existence as a partly independent force strengthened his bargaining position with the British. If they became too deeply tied into British command, their identity might weaken. If too independent, they risked being seen as a private militia rather than a support to regional stability. Idris, therefore, moved carefully, pressing the British for political promises, even as he made the Scouts available for shared security work. Archival accounts describe meetings in which British officers urged the standardization of equipment and procedures. They wanted more regular reporting, clearer ranks, and consistent command lines. The Scouts agreed where it made sense, but kept the elements that made them effective: local recruitment, flexible patrol patterns, and a leadership system rooted partly in tribal custom. Some British officers, experienced in desert warfare and familiar with Idris's role, supported this balance. Others, shaped by more formal military models, struggled with a force that did not match traditional units. Demobilization brought its own tensions. Many Scouts expected that their wartime service would lead to permanent roles in Sirenica's security system, but British planners faced their own limits. The end of the North African campaign came as global priorities shifted. Resources were moved elsewhere, administrative staff reassigned, and political questions about Libya's future, still under Allied occupation, remained unsettled. As a result, not all Scouts could join new structures. Some were offered places in an expanded frontier force. Others were quietly released, their service recognized, but their future uncertain. This change also raised deeper questions about identity. Were the Scouts' wartime auxiliaries tied to Allied plans only for convenience? Were they local defenders of Idris's authority? Or had they become something larger, an early version of what Cyrenacan security might look like under self-rule? Different groups saw it differently. For some tribal leaders, the Scouts had proven their value by protecting communities during years of trouble. For younger recruits, they were a rare chance at formal work and social progress. For the British, they were essential during the war but potentially awkward in the peace that followed. An attempt to reorganize the Scouts into what would become parts of the Cyrenaica Defense Force highlighted these uncertainties. British administrators tried to sort roles. Some men would be trackers, others constables, and a smaller number field patrolmen. Yet even as titles changed, the core of the Scouts' strength stayed the same. Their ability to move through vast, thinly populated terrain with confidence, and their deep roots in the society they were asked to police. Talks between Idris and British officials grew more serious in 1943. Idris wanted guarantees for Sirenica's autonomy and recognition of his leadership. The British, aware of broader diplomatic issues, moved carefully. But they knew that stability depended on Idris's cooperation and on keeping the trust of communities that had helped the Allied cause. The Scouts thus became part of a larger political negotiation. Their continued service showed partnership, but their possible breakup or absorption into a foreign-led force risked damaging local confidence. Arguments about their legacy began even before the war ended. Some British officers praised the Scouts as vital allies. Others doubted their long-term reliability, reflecting common colonial biases. Among Libyans, views were also mixed. Some saw the Scouts as defenders who had protected refugees and supported Senusi authority during harsh years. Others believed they had been pushed into service by circumstances rather than choice. These views would later shape how the Scouts were remembered in the post-war story. By late 1943, as the Axis threat in Libya disappeared and Allied priorities shifted toward Italy, the Scouts stood at a crossroads. Their wartime role, flexible, partly independent, and deeply local, had few equals in formal state systems. Yet their knowledge, leadership, and name had proved too important to ignore. A negotiation took shape between what the British wanted, a disciplined frontier force, and what Idris sought, a base for Cyrenaican self-rule built on local traditions. The outcome stayed uncertain as the war's centre moved north. Some Scouts were given new posts under fresh administrative plans, others returned to their tribes, and a small number began shaping what would later become Libya's post-war security forces. But the larger question, how their wartime experience would shape the country's political future, still lay ahead. With victory in North Africa secured, the Scouts now faced a different challenge: how to carry their legacy into a world no longer defined by advancing armies, but by the slow, complex work of building a nation. Their next chapter would unfold not on battlefields, but in the early steps toward independence. A small wartime force becomes a foundation for a nation. When the North African campaign ended, and the sound of engines faded from Sireneca's horizon, the Senusi Scouts faced a landscape no longer shaped by military movement, but by the slow return of ordinary life. Wells reopened to herders, caravans resumed their steady rhythms, and communities long displaced by Italian repression or wartime chaos began drifting back toward familiar villages. Yet beneath this surface, the Scouts sensed that their work was not ending, it was changing. The Allied occupation that followed Axis withdrawal left Libya in an unusual position. The country had lived through decades of Italian rule, years of conflict, and the shock of a global war fought partly across its land. No clear administrative successor existed. Instead, British and French authorities managed different regions, while international debates unfolded about Libya's future. In this uncertainty, Idris appeared once more as a stabilizing figure, and the Scouts, though changed by demobilization, remained symbols of his lasting presence. In the months after the Axis retreat, British administrators returned to the question that had followed the Scouts since their creation. What role could they play in shaping security now that the war had passed? The British needed local forces able to watch borders, patrol remote regions, and keep order without heavy-handed control. The Scouts, with their close knowledge of terrain and their strong links to communities, were natural choices, but they were also rooted in a tradition that came before modern state systems, making their inclusion a careful and delicate process. Slowly, the Scouts' wartime skills flowed into new institutions. Some were recruited into the new Frontier Force, an organization tasked with guarding Libya's wide and open borders. Their experiences during the war, moving between rival armies and protecting isolated communities, fit well with duties that demanded judgment and initiative. Others found places in early police units, where their understanding of tribal life helped settle disputes and maintain social peace. The change was not the same for everyone. Many former Scouts returned to their tribes, choosing a pastoral life over government service. A few became local administrators or intermediaries, relied on by British officials trying to understand the worries of rural communities. Others remained involved informally, guiding Allied staff, assisting with post-war surveys, or providing local knowledge to civil authorities. The desert itself, however, remembered them all. Their routes, their lookout points, and their stories remained woven into the memory of Sirenica. As Libya moved carefully toward independence, the Scouts' legacy took on new meaning. Their wartime service became part of the story used to support Idris's leadership. He had sided with the Allies at a key moment, provided intelligence, and contributed forces that shaped campaigns along the frontier. These actions strengthened his position when international talks grew more intense. When Sirenica later joined with Tripolitania and Fezzan to form a united Libyan state, Idris's right to rule drew partly on the continuity of structures, formal and informal, that the Scouts had helped maintain. Yet the Scouts' legacy was more complex than later patriotic stories sometimes suggested. They were never a single uniform group. Their reasons for serving ranged from resistance to Italian rule to loyalty toward Idris, from local duties to practical survival. Some families remembered them as protectors. Others saw them as men trapped between foreign armies and tribal pressures. Still, the effect of their work was clear. During some of Libya's most unsettled decades, they provided a thread of stability across a landscape repeatedly torn apart. As the new kingdom took shape after 1951, the principles that had defined the Scouts continued to live on in certain institutions. The frontier force relied heavily on local knowledge and flexible patrol methods. Early police units used community-based practices built on trust rather than strict distance and hierarchy. In remote areas, informal networks similar to the Scouts' wartime communication channels continued to carry news, settle disputes, and warn authorities of possible dangers. These were not direct inheritances. No single order turned the Scouts into state officers, but the habits and understandings they embodied helped shape the culture of Libya's growing security system. Over time, memory added its own layers. In some versions, the Scouts became heroic guides who ensured Allied victories. In others, they appeared as practical go-betweens, managing the pressures of occupation and resistance. Oral histories kept in families across Sirenica tell of nights spent shadowing enemy patrols, of carrying messages across empty plains, or of guiding lost pilots to safety. British memoirs often recall the Scouts' remarkable navigation skills, their quiet competence, and their ability to read desert conditions with a subtlety that technology could not match. But memory also smoothed over contradictions. It could hide the inner tensions the Scouts faced, choosing whom to trust, how to act when loyalties crossed, or how to support Idris without inviting punishment from occupying forces. It sometimes forgot those who went their own way after the war, whose service did not bring formal honor or secure work. Yet even these forgotten stories hold the essence of the Scouts' existence, a mix of resilience, adaptation, and identity, grounded not in sameness, but in continuity with the land itself. Today, the Senusi Scouts are remembered less for their numbers than for their influence. Their presence shaped reconnaissance during key operations, supported communities through repeated crises, and helped uphold the authority of a leadership that would guide Libya toward independence. They showed that in a landscape defined by distance and scarcity, power could rest not in heavy weapons or large formations, but in the knowledge carried by those who walked the ground long before the first armored column arrived. As Libya stepped into its post-war future, the Scouts' story remained a reminder that nations are often built by forces that never stand on parade squares or appear in official photographs. Their legacy lived in the quiet inheritance of a desert way of seeing the world, one that valued patience, memory, and the understanding that movement across vast, open ground is shaped as much by wisdom as by strength. And so, long after the armies left, the lines they traced across the sands continued to guide a country still learning how to find its own path forward. Let me know which forgotten World War II force you want explored next. and we'll uncover it together. Subscribe, like, and share to help these untold stories reach more viewers. And join the discussion below. Your insights keep this history alive.